The breathing was wrong, not labored in the way you expect from a man whose lungs are filling with fluid. It was irregular in a different way, a pause, then a rush of air, then another pause longer than the first, as though something were timing the intervals deliberately. I had been called to a hospital room at 2:30 in the morning, a man in his mid-60s, Catholic by baptism, 40 years of drifting behind him. His daughter had reached me through the parish. She said he was asking for a priest. She said that, and then she paused, and I heard in her silence what she did not know how to put into words. I drove there, I walked through the corridors, I reached the door of the room. I knew before I crossed the threshold. There is a quality to certain rooms, not a smell, not a sound, nothing that precise, more like a pressure change, something that registers below the level of the named senses. I have been in enough of these rooms across enough years that I no longer question the recognition. I simply note it and proceed. I am going to tell you what happened in that room, what I've seen at bedsides like that one over 2 decades of this work, and what the church has always known about the moment when a soul stands at the edge of death. I am going to tell you, because what is happening in those rooms is happening with greater frequency, and because fewer people are prepared to meet it, and because the silence of the institutional church on these matters has cost souls that did not have to be lost. My name is Chad Ripperger. I am a priest in the Fraternity of St. Peter, and for more than 2 decades, I have worked in deliverance ministry and exorcism under the jurisdiction of diocesan bishops. What I am about to share draws from my published Corpus Dominion, the deliverance prayers for use by the laity, lectures given through Sensus Fidelium across many years. The composite details in this account have been altered to protect the family involved who gave their permission for the underlying pattern to be shared. I cannot give you names, I will not, but the spiritual architecture, what happened there, is real, and it is not singular. This is what I have seen. The room was ordinary in the way hospital rooms are ordinary, an aluminum framed window, a plastic chair in the corner with a jacket thrown over its back, a half-eaten cup of gelatin on the side table. For 400 years, the church provided the laity with specific prayers to address situations in their homes that they could not explain. Most parishes stopped teaching them after 1965. Now, they have all been compiled into a concise, practical guide. Keep it near the door and read the first page tonight. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first pinned comment. The overhead light was off. A lamp on the far side of the bed cast everything in a low yellow. His daughter was seated near him, her hands folded in her lap. His son stood against the wall with his arms crossed, not hostile, simply the posture of a man who has been awake for 36 hours and has run out of ways to help. There was a rosary on the nightstand. I noticed it because it had the quality of an object recently placed there, something clean and undisturbed that had not been in frequent use. Someone had put it there for the occasion. The man himself was propped on 2 pillows. His color was poor. His breathing held that rhythm I mentioned, the pause, the rush, the longer pause. His eyes were open. That was the first thing I registered. His eyes were open and they were moving, tracking something in the air above the foot of the bed. Not the way a man tracks the ceiling when he is confused or sedated. He was tracking something with attention, with focus. His daughter introduced me. He looked at me when she said my name, and then his expression changed. I want to be precise here, because precision matters, and imprecision in this area produces either panic or dismissal, both of which are useless to anyone. His expression did not become monstrous. That is not how this typically works. What happened was subtler and, in some ways, more disturbing for the subtlety. A quality came into his face, a quality of contempt that did not belong to him. His daughter told me afterward that her father had never in his life looked at a priest that way. He had been indifferent to priests for decades. Not hostile, indifferent. The way a man is indifferent to a trade he chose not to enter. This was something else. This was active. I have seen that look on faces before. I set down my bag, I took out the oils and the ritual, and I began the rite of anointing. His eyes followed my hands, not with the curiosity of a sick man watching a stranger perform an unfamiliar action, with a quality of attention that was more like surveillance, calculating. The eyes were doing mathematics. His breathing slowed. The son stepped forward. He asked me in a low voice whether his father was in pain. I told him not to worry about that right now and to pray the rosary, and I handed him the one from the nightstand. He looked at it for a moment, a man who had not held one since his confirmation, probably, and then he did what I said. He sat down in the chair beside the bed and he began, haltingly, from memory, stumbling over the words, which is exactly the right way to start. What follows is the part I want you to understand doctrinally, not because doctrine is abstract, but because without it you cannot understand what you are looking at when you stand in a room like that one. The experiential and the theological are not separate. One illuminates the other. I cannot give you the room without the doctrine, and I cannot give you the doctrine without the room. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologiae, questions 50 through 64, the first part, establishes the nature of angelic intellect and demonic intellect with a precision that centuries of pastoral experience have only confirmed. The fallen angels retain the natural powers of their intellect. What they do not retain is the supernatural orientation toward God that was given in their creation and then irrevocably rejected in the moment of their fall. What this means practically is that they are extraordinarily intelligent, extraordinarily patient, and they operate through influence rather than through direct causation. They cannot read the interior of the will. They cannot compel the will. But they can read the body, the face, the posture, the tone of voice, the patterns of desire and fear and regret that a man's whole life has written into his exterior behavior, and they can infer from these patterns what a man is likely to do under pressure. They are not omniscient, but they have had a very long time to study the species. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote more than a dozen questions on how fallen angels operate. Most Catholics have never read one line of it. This archive gathers that teaching, the 1,614 rite, and 4 centuries of documented cases into a single reference. Read it slowly, 1 chapter a night. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first posted comment. And they have observed every configuration of human weakness that exists. The first letter of Peter says it plainly, your adversary the devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. The word in the Greek is peripete. He walks around, he circuits, he surveys. He is looking, always calculating the angle. What the demonic looks for at the end of a man's life is the open door that the man's life has built, not through one dramatic sin, but through pattern. 30 years away from the sacraments is a pattern. The sacraments are the ordinary means by which divine grace is infused into the soul, and when those means are refused or neglected over decades, the soul does not remain neutral. It accumulates the residue of unconfessed sin, unaddressed attachments, habitual dispositions toward things that are not God. The soul becomes, over time, a structure with a particular internal geography, certain rooms locked, others wide open, corridors that lead in directions the man himself has forgotten choosing. The curé d'Ars, Jean-Baptiste Marie Vianney, who died on the 4th of August, 1859, spoke throughout his ministry of Le Grappin, the claw, the demonic that pursued him, physically and audibly, that made the floor shake and the bed drag across the room, that mocked him and imitated voices. He was not speaking metaphorically. He understood from direct experience what Aquinas established in principle. The demonic does not simply appear at the end of a life. It is present throughout the life. It is looking for purchase. And the deathbed is its final opportunity, the last moment when the contest is still open. Padre Pio bore the stigmata beginning on the 20th of September, 1918, and he spoke throughout his decades of ministry of the demonic as a constant adversary encountered in prayer, in the confessional, in the exorcisms he himself performed. The wounds in his hands were real and documented. His encounters with what pursued him were real. Neither he nor the curé d'Ars were prone to exaggeration. They were men of rigorous prayer and long suffering, and what they described because it was what they had lived. The man in the bed in that hospital room had spent 30 years building a pattern. He had left Mass sometime in his late 30s following a divorce. He had moved through a second arrangement that was not a sacramental marriage. His children had been raised in the loosely Catholic way that became common in the decades after the Council, Christmas, Easter, perhaps a school that had the word Catholic in its name. He was not an evil man in any dramatic sense. He was an ordinary man, a decent man in many of the ordinary ways, whose soul had slowly gone unguarded because the practices that guard it had been set aside one at a time, each setting aside small enough to feel inconsequential. Now, he was 63 years old in a hospital bed, and the door that 30 years of negligence had left open was being used. Dr. Richard Gallagher, the Columbia-trained psychiatrist who has written publicly about his experience consulting with Catholic exorcists over several decades, observed in his published accounts that the phenomena he witnessed in genuine cases could not be explained by any category available to his psychiatric training, not psychosis, not dissociative disorder, not malingering, not temporal lobe events. He arrived at a position of reluctant credibility. Something was present that was not the patient, that had access to information the patient could not have possessed, and that responded to sacred actions with behaviors that were specific, consistent, and repeatable. I cite Gallagher not as a theological authority, but as a witness from outside the tradition who had every professional incentive to find a natural explanation and could not. What I observed in that room was consistent with the pattern Gallagher and others have described. The Roman ritual of 1614, the Rituale Romanum, issued under Paul V, contains the rites for the dying with a weight and a clarity that the 1999 revision, whatever its other pastoral intentions, considerably softens. The 1614 rite does not soften. It names what is present in the room with a dying Christian. It addresses the powers arrayed against the soul with the full authority of the Church. It places the dying person within a chain of intercession, the priest acting in persona Christi, the Church militant praying, the angels present at the bedside, the saints whose names are invoked, and it does not treat the adversary as a metaphor or a psychological state. It treats it as what it is. I administered the older rite. I will not describe in detail what happened during those prayers. There are things that took place in that room that are not appropriate for public account, that belong to the gravity of a deathbed and to the trust of a family. What I will say is that the man's expression changed multiple times during the prayers. What I will say is that by the time I reached the commendation of the soul, his breathing had changed again, slower, steadier, no longer with that calculating quality in the pauses, and his eyes had changed. And his daughter, who had been praying the rosary with her brother, looked up from her beads and said quietly, almost to herself, "There he is. That's him." She was right. Something had shifted. Whether the man himself understood what had happened in that room, I cannot say. He was not in a condition to discuss it. But his face in those final hours had a quality it had not had when I arrived. A man's face. Just a man. I want to tell you now exactly what the Church teaches about what happens at the last breath, because this is the promise of this account, and I want to honor it fully. The moment of death is not a passage into unconsciousness. It is the most intensely conscious moment of a human life. The Church teaches, and this is not pious opinion, but doctrinal weight carried through Aquinas, through the Council of Florence in 1439, through the unanimous teaching of the tradition of the saints and the doctors, that at the moment of death, the soul undergoes what is called the particular judgment. It is instantaneous, complete. There is no deliberation, no appeal, no second examination. The soul sees itself as it truly is, stripped of every pretense and every rationalization, and it sees God as He truly is. And the disproportion between what the soul is and what God is either the beginning of the soul's purification and eventual entrance into glory, or the beginning of its separation. The judgment is rendered from that single vision. It cannot be altered after death. There is no advocacy after the particular judgment. There is no further opportunity. But before the last breath in those final moments, while the soul is still joined to the body and the will is still capable of act, the contest is in progress. And the demonic knows this. It has always known this. The Church identifies 3 specific temptations that the demonic makes at the deathbed. Against faith, the dying person is pressed toward doubt, toward the conviction that none of what the Church teaches was real, that the sacraments were theater performed by men in costume, that God is either absent or indifferent, or a construct that the man is wise to dismiss in his final clarity. Against hope, The dying person is pressed toward despair, the conviction that whatever was done in the life cannot be forgiven, that the accumulated weight of 30 years of negligence and sin is too heavy for any mercy to lift, that God's grace has a ceiling and the soul in question hit it long ago. Against charity, the dying person is pressed toward a final refusal, a closing of the will against the love that is being offered, a last turning away from God that is in its essence the soul choosing itself over everything else in the moment when the choice becomes permanent. These three temptations can be quiet. They can arrive as thoughts that feel like the man's own thoughts. A man who has not prayed in 30 years has no practiced habit of discernment, no muscle memory for recognizing where a thought is coming from. He does not know how to ask whose voice that is. The guardian angel is present. The church teaches that every soul has a guardian angel assigned at birth, an angelic protector whose role includes this specific moment. The guardian angel defends. The prayers of those present at the deathbed are weapons, not gestures, not comfort rituals, but actual spiritual operations. The rosary being prayed haltingly by a man who had not held one since his confirmation was not a cultural gesture. It was operational. It counted. It reached. The apostolic pardon, the plenary indulgence granted to the dying by a priest in good standing, remits the temporal punishment due to sin at the moment it is granted. It requires the proper dispositions of the dying person and the proper form from the priest. But when given rightly, the church herself stands behind it. The priest is not acting on his own authority. He is acting as a delegate of the Roman pontiff, and through that chain of Christ, the indulgence is real, the remission is real. I gave it to that man. His daughter asked me afterward in the corridor whether I thought her father was going to be all right. I told her the truth, which is that I had done what the church gives us to do, that I had used the instruments I was given, that I had reason for hope, and that what had happened in those final moments was between her father's soul and God. I told her that God's mercy is not a polite fiction. It is real, and it does not mock sincere recourse. She stood there in the corridor for a moment, and then she said thank you in the way people say thank you when they mean something deeper than gratitude. I cannot tell you the outcome of that particular judgment. I was not given knowledge of it. No priest is. I was given the instruments and the authority to deploy them, and I deployed them. The rest belongs to God. This is where the composite nature of what I share requires me to acknowledge its limits. I cannot give you a name, a city, a specific hospital, a specific year. The family gave their permission for the underlying spiritual pattern to be shared, and I honor that permission by protecting every detail that could identify them. What I offer is not anecdote. It is the pattern I've observed across many cases condensed into one account that holds the architecture of all of them. Now, I want to tell you what this means for you practically while you are alive and the contest is still ahead. Confession, not as a last resort, not as the act of a man who has run out of time and is covering his bets. Confession used regularly, monthly at minimum, weekly if possible, builds an interior structure. It builds the habit of self-examination. It builds a practiced awareness of the state of the soul that is entirely different from the vague spiritual anxiety that most Catholics carry around without addressing it. The man who has confessed regularly for 30 years arrives at the deathbed with a different interior architecture than the man who has not. The three temptations find different territory. The demonic temptation against faith finds less purchase in a man whose faith has been exercised continuously, whose relationship with God has been repaired and renewed repeatedly through the sacrament, who knows from his own experience what it feels like to receive absolution and the weight of it lifting. That knowledge is not theoretical. It is in the body and the memory and the will. The sacrament of confession is established in the 20th chapter of John. Christ breathes on the apostles the deliberate echo of Genesis, the new creation, and says, "Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven them. Whose sins you shall retain, they are retained." This is a juridical act with real spiritual effects. The absolution of a priest actually remits sin. The guilt is gone. The temporal punishment that remains is addressed through penance, through indulgences, through the patient suffering of this life united to Christ's passion, but the guilt itself gone. This matters. The Eucharist, received worthily in a state of grace, after confession, if there is mortal sin, is what it is: the body and blood of Christ. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 defined transubstantiation as the Church's understanding of what happens at the consecration of the Mass. The substance of bread and wine becomes the substance of Christ's body and blood, the appearances remaining. A soul that has received the Eucharist worthily across decades carries something that the temptations against faith cannot easily dislodge, because the faith is not theoretical. The soul has met Christ in the sacrament repeatedly over many years, and that encounter, in the deepest sense of that word, not a feeling, but a real meeting between the soul and God, is present at the last breath. Sacramentals are not decorations. The brown scapular, the rosary, the crucifix on the bedroom wall, holy water at the door, these are instruments of the Church's blessing extended into the material spaces where daily life is lived. A home that has been blessed by a priest, in which the family prays, in which sacred objects are present and in use, is a home that has been placed under the protection of the Church and the intercession of the saints. This is the ordinary application of the Church's treasury of grace to the world in which you actually live. Consecrate your family to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Do it formally with the words. Write the date down. Renew it each year. This is not a gesture. It is a legal act of entrustment, placing your household under the particular intercession and protection of Christ through His Sacred Heart and of Our Lady through her Immaculate Heart. The Church has approved this devotion. The saints have lived it. Do it. Now I want to speak about why this moment in history is particular, because it is particular. Data from polling organizations over the past decade consistently show that fewer than 30% of Catholics in the United States believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist as the Church defines it, not merely a special symbol, but the actual body and blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. This is the central doctrine of Catholic sacramental life. When a Catholic does not believe this, he cannot receive the Eucharist as it is meant to be received. The reception requires faith in what is being received, and when that faith is absent, the soul is not nourished in the way it needs to be nourished. This is not a marginal failure. It is a catechetical collapse of historic proportions. It did not happen in one decade. It accumulated over the years following the Second Vatican Council, which ran from 1962 to 1965, through a widespread abandonment of the rigor with which the faith had previously been transmitted. The Council itself did not cause this. The Council is not the problem. But the period following it produced, in many dioceses, a catechetical approach that treated doctrine as one perspective among several, that was more comfortable with questions than with answers, that formed children in a kind of affective religiosity without giving them the doctrinal skeleton that holds a faith upright when it is tested. The result is several generations of Catholics who receive the sacraments of initiation and who do not know what those sacraments are or what they do. They were not given what they needed to survive the temptations at the last breath. The collapse of confession compounds this. Confession lines in most American parishes in 2026 are thin in a way they were not in 1960. The reasons are multiple: the loss of the sense of mortal sin, the displacement of confession by a general sense of divine tolerance, the simple logistical reduction in confession hours. But the effect is measurable. The ordinary means by which a Catholic soul is regularized and nourished has effectively ceased to function for most of the baptized in the West. No-fault divorce was enacted in California in 1969 and spread to every American state within a decade and across most of Western Europe within 2 decades. The collapse of the sacramental family that followed is not only a sociological phenomenon, it is a spiritual one. Children raised without an intact Catholic family do not receive the formation in prayer, in the sacraments, in the habits of faith that they are meant to receive. The habit of Sunday Mass is transmitted in a family. The practice of daily prayer is transmitted in a family. The rosary is prayed by a grandmother and taught to a grandchild who is sitting next to her and watching her fingers. When the family fractures, the transmission breaks and the rupture propagates into the next generation. The 1999 revision of the exorcism rite, approved under John Paul II, who survived the assassination attempt of the 13th of May, 1981, and attributed his survival to Our Lady of Fatima, introduced procedural requirements that the 1,614 Rituale Romanum did not contain. The 1999 rite requires physician evaluation, the ruling out of psychological causes, explicit episcopal permission, multiple consultations before the major rite is authorized. These requirements are not unreasonable in the abstract, but in practice they produce a process that can extend for months, during which a person in genuine spiritual distress receives no formal ecclesial intervention. The 1614 rite trusted the judgment of the trained priest. The 1999 rite trusts the committee. The institutional caution has costs, and the costs are borne by the people in the rooms. I want to be clear, I am not attacking the church. The church is the bride of Christ and carries what no human institution could carry: the deposit of faith, the sacraments, the apostolic succession, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. None of that is in question. What I am describing is the gap between what the church has and what the institutional apparatus at the parish and diocesan level is currently transmitting to the faithful. Those are two different things. The treasure is intact, the pipes are corroded. Pope Francis died on the 21st of April, 2025. Leo XIV was elected on the 8th of May, 2025. We are in a new pontificate in 2026, and what this pontificate will do about the formation of the faithful for spiritual combat is not yet fully clear. I do not speculate about ecclesiastical futures. What I can tell you is what I have observed across 2 decades in the rooms where the cost of these failures presents itself most starkly. And what I have observed is that the people arriving at the deathbed are less formed, less nourished in the sacraments, and less equipped for the contest that awaits them there. The enemy has not become more powerful. What has changed is a resistance. I should be honest with you about the limits of my certainty here. There are deathbed cases I have attended where I could not say with confidence what was present. Dying produces altered states. Medication produces altered states. The human mind, under the pressure of imminent death, produces experiences that require careful evaluation. I am not in the business of claiming demonic presence everywhere or of inflaming fear where it is not warranted. What I can say is that there is a recognizable pattern that the tradition has named it and addressed it across 2,000 years, and that the retreat from that tradition has left ordinary Catholics without the instruments the Church herself developed to protect them. That is what I am asking you to carry away. Here is what you do now. Go to confession this week, not this month, this week. If you are in mortal sin, you know it. If you are uncertain, a good confessor will help you examine your conscience. The sacrament requires genuine contrition, actual sorrow for the offense against God, not merely the discomfort of being caught a firm purpose of amendment and the verbal confession to a priest. These 3 things: the priest absolves, grace enters, the state of the soul changes. Find a confessor who knows you, not just any priest who is available on a Saturday afternoon. A priest who knows your history, who can see your patterns over time, who can name your habitual sins to you with the charity that comes from long familiarity and the authority that comes from the sacrament. Spiritual direction is not a luxury for religious professionals. It is the ordinary care that a soul requires. Receive the Eucharist worthily. If you are not in a state of grace, confess first. St. Paul writes in the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians that whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily eats and drinks judgment upon himself. This is not a threat designed to keep people away from the altar. It is a description of what happens when a sacred act is performed without the interior disposition it requires. The Eucharist is what it is, whether or not the recipient believes it, and the soul that receives it in a state of mortal sin is in a condition that the Church has always treated with seriousness. Have your home blessed by a priest. Put a crucifix on the wall of the main room. Put one in each bedroom. Get holy water from the parish and keep it at the entrance of the home. Use it. Bless yourself when you leave and when you return. These are not superstitions. They are the Church's instruments of grace applied to the places where your daily life takes place, the places where you sleep and eat and argue and love and fail and try again. Consecrate the family to the Sacred Heart and the Immaculate Heart. Do it on a specific day and write it down. Renew it each year on the same day. Pray the rosary daily, not as a recitation that you get through, but as a meditation on the mysteries, the events of Christ's life and death and the life of his mother, entered through sustained attention and the repetition of prayer that has been refined over centuries to do what it does. Form your children in the faith while there is time. Tell them what the Mass is. Tell them what the Eucharist is. Take them to confession. Pray with them in the home so that prayer is not an institutional activity confined to Sunday, but the ordinary fabric of daily life. If they have not been told these things, tell them now. The formation that was supposed to happen in the parish often did not happen. The formation that can still happen is the formation in the home. I have